Hello and good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me, and thanks for joining this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, seminar. So it's a great pleasure to have Rachel Thorpe giving us a seminar today. So Rachel, she's a senior research fellow at the Australian Red Cross Lifeblood in Australia, and she's interested in donor health as part of the donor research group. And she is really discussing with us and presenting to us some of the research she's been doing about donors and donor perspective on receiving information from routine genomic testing of blood donors. This is quite an important aspect internationally, but as well nationally. As you know, there's a strong interest about use of genetics in donors, in particular in NHSBT. So it's really timely and really great to hear from you, Rachel. So I'll leave you the floor, and as usual, please keep your camera off. I think we'll once the talk is finished, we have the opportunity to ask questions. You can either put those on chat, or you can really raise your hand, and you have opportunity to ask the question to Rachel. So Rachel, up to you.
Okay, thanks, Emanuele. It's lovely to be here. Good morning, everyone. It's nighttime where I am. I will share my screen, and hopefully somebody will let me know if that is sharing properly. Can you see presenter mode?
That's perfect.
Yep, perspectives
Okay.
of current and potential donors.
Yes, great. And it's in presenter mode, yeah?
Yep,
okay, excellent.
Full screen,
okay.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. So today, as I mentioned, I'm presenting some work conducted by myself and other members of our research team on perspectives of current and potential donors on genomic testing of donated blood. So this is some work conducted by the donor research team at Australian Red Cross Lifeblood, the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland, and the University of Eastern Finland. So the background for this work is that in Australia, the demand for phenotyped and genotyped blood has increased but quite a lot, by 50% since 2019, with this trend expected to continue. Genotyped blood is mainly requested for patients needing long-term transfusion support, such as patients with sickle cell disease, or for pregnancy-related transfusions, to be able to more closely match donor blood to recipients and avoid alloimmunization. Currently, Lifeblood conducts extended phenotyping on only about 6% of donations, and about 1% of donations are genotyped. But researchers are estimating that we need about 35% of our donors to be genotyped or phenotyped to meet demand. As methods used to genotype blood are becoming faster and cheaper, this will enable more donations to be genotyped at lower cost. The second point of interest is that researchers are studying genetic markers of importance to blood donor health, for example, markers related to iron metabolism. And the hope is that this research can be used to individualize donor management, for example, developing individualized donation intervals, or suggesting different donation types for different donors, and therefore reduce costs associated with donor deferrals. Because deferrals, obviously, a lot of donors don't come back once they're deferred. Finally, if whole genome sequencing of blood donors was undertaken, blood collection agencies like Lifeblood could potentially identify genetic markers not related to blood donation, such as those associated with predisposition to disease. And this is not something that Lifeblood's necessarily planning to do, but we were interested to know if donors would like to receive this kind of information through blood donation if it was available. So research suggests that in general, blood donors tend to be quite positive about participating in genetic research, such as biobanking through blood banks, and the use of their blood samples being used for research. blood bank run biobanks have had great success in recruiting donors to participate. However, donors generally don't receive results returned to them from participation in biobanks. And a study conducted in the United States found that around 67% of donors were actually interested in participating in genetic research where they could receive results. Researchers also investigated whether donors consider that donating blood for research or for biobanking is actually consistent with their reasons for donating blood and with the mission of blood collection agencies. So this work indicates that donors do actually distinguish between donating for patients compared with donating for research. However, we don't know much about donor perspectives on routine testing of their blood when they donate, such as genotyping, and on their views on the impact of receiving information from this testing. So questions with this research were, well, what do donors and eligible non-donors know about what their blood is currently tested for in Australia? And what do they know about the kinds of information that could be provided to them in the future? What are their views on whether receiving this information is appropriate and whether they've consented to it? And generally, from our perspective, we wanted to know this information because it can help us to plan for communicating with donors and the public about any changes that are made to testing of donor blood to ensure that we're maintaining a trust relationship with our volunteer donors. So just a little bit of context to blood donation in Australia. Australian Red Cross Lifeblood is the sole provider of blood products in Australia. We're an operating division of the Australian Red Cross Society, and we're funded through federal and state governments. And that funding is managed for us on behalf of a regulator called the National Blood Authority. And our healthcare system is a mix of public and private. In terms of donation types, whole blood can be donated by anyone every 12 weeks or up to 4 times a year, and plasma can be donated as often as every 2 weeks. So just a little bit about the methodological approach that we took. So this is a qualitative research study. And when conducting this research, we decided to focus on how meanings of genomic testing are produced or shaped by participants through their participation in the research, rather than assuming that they would hold any particular views prior to participating in the research or whether their knowledge is necessarily scientifically accurate, which is a constructivist approach. And we took this approach because research into public perspectives on genomics suggests that often unless people have been directly impacted by genomics or genetic conditions, they tend to not have a lot of pre-existing knowledge about genetics or genomics, if any at all. And interestingly, in our focus groups, these took place in 2021, and our participants had a little bit of familiarity with the word genomics because of COVID, and so they'd heard a bit of talking about genomics in relation to COVID, but besides that, they'd never really heard the term before. And in general, views about genetics and genomics tend to differ quite a lot based on demographic factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, level of education, where the research is being conducted, who it will help, and whether participants are healthy or patients. And we wanted to know what was important about genomics to donors and eligible non-donors in this very specific context of blood donation, understanding that their perspectives will differ from perspectives of people with expertise in genomics, because we wanted to understand what is important for them in terms of what we would need to do if we increase testing of donor blood, and how that might influence their willingness to continue to participate in blood donation. So we used focus groups for this study because we really were interested in how people would discuss these topics. We wanted to access insights generated through group discussion and interaction on the topic. And the team developed some scenarios to present to participants in the focus groups based upon current and possible future genomic testing of donor blood, to encourage participants to put themselves in the sort of shoes of a donor who's received genomic testing results. Using scenarios is a good way to help people to encourage participants to raise self-identified issues and allows them to bring their own behaviours, opinions and beliefs into the discussion. So the scenarios were developed by social scientists, medical officers with genomics experience and members of our red cell reference laboratories who were quite interested in whether donors would be interested in knowing about incidental information that could be identified through genotyping. The participants were recruited either through Lifeblood's donor database, or the non-donors were recruited using a social research company. Donors were sampled to provide diversity in donation experience, gender, age, location, and ethnicity, and non-donors completed a screening survey to assess their eligibility to donate blood, so they had to be eligible to donate blood to participate, and to facilitate recruitment of participants with diversity in gender, age, and location. So in total, we conducted 8 focus groups. We had 24 donor participants, 24 non-donor participants. They ranged in age from 18 to 65, and they were fairly evenly divided between men and women, and there was some diversity of ethnicity. The ethnicity wasn't representative of the ethnic diversity of the Australian population, and that does to a certain extent reflect our donor panel in Australia, which is predominantly of European or Australian background. So the 3 scenarios that we presented donors with, the first one was about a donor receiving a letter informing them that they have a rare blood type. So this is obviously something that we do already. This happens, all the time. When donors receive this letter, it encourages them to donate regularly. It tells them that their blood may be frozen for up to 10 years and that they may be contacted to donate for a specific patient. It also encourages them to talk to family members about the rare blood type and to invite family members to come and donate blood. So the second scenario is something that we don't do, but potentially we could do in the future, which is that the donor receives a letter telling them that they have a genetic marker that's implicated in iron metabolism and means that they aren't able to replace the iron in their blood as fast as some people are. And the letter then suggests that the donor should donate whole blood only 2 times per year instead of the maximum allowed of 4 times per year, or donates plasma. In the third scenario, the donor receives a phone call informing them that testing of their blood by Lifeblood has identified that they are at a higher risk of developing bowel cancer and advises them to discuss this with their doctor. And so each focus group started with a bit of background explanation of our research and by a medical officer who explained a bit about genotyping and phenotyping at Lifeblood. And then we had some general questions about what people know about what their blood is tested for if they come and donate or when they donate. And then the scenarios were introduced in this order every time. So starting with rare blood types and then finishing with the bowel cancer scenario. Followed by some discussion prompts about people's views on receiving these communications, their perspectives on consent, and their perspectives on the appropriateness of receiving this information from Lifeblood. And the focus groups were recorded and transcribed verbatim, and the data were coded into categories using an inductive approach and analysed using thematic analysis. So this slide, moving into the findings, this slide shows the overarching themes that we identified from our data. We found that participants tended to think about each scenario and genomic testing in general from the perspective of what they would expect Lifeblood to be doing with donated blood. which we've called the core purpose of a blood collection agency. Both donor and non-donor participants generally agreed that blood donors have consented to their blood being tested for purposes that are directly related to this core purpose, and that this agreement forms a contract between the donor and the organisation. And through discussions on the different scenarios, participants raised boundaries to this core purpose, the idea of what the role of a blood collection agency is in the healthcare system, and preventative health. And surprisingly, donor and non-donor perspectives were very similar, despite donors having a lot more personal experience of donation. Their views were actually very similar. And so I'll present the donor and non-donor data together. I'm not going to differentiate between findings for those two groups. And in the results slides, you'll see I've used some participant quotes to sort of illustrate how people talked about these topics. So starting with the rare blood type scenario, participants thought that it was generally very appropriate for Lifeblood to test donor blood for rare blood types. And the reason they thought that is because they thought this testing was of benefit to recipients and would improve transfusion outcomes for recipients. And views on Lifeblood undertaking this testing were overwhelmingly positive, with participants perceiving that for them, if they found out that they have a rare blood type, this would really increase the value of their donations, because they would have this additional information about how it was helping and who it was helping, and they would feel quite special if they received that information. And generally, participants perceive that as a donor, you've consented to your blood being tested for purposes related to donor and recipient safety, which they felt would include rare blood type testing. And you have consented to receive information about this. So they felt as though rare blood type testing was something that is covered by existing donor consent. However, none of the participants were aware that Lifeblood undertakes rare blood type testing. And so even though they did think this kind of testing was covered by existing consent, they didn't feel as though it was informed consent. So moving on to discussions around the iron metabolism scenario. Participants generally perceived information about iron metabolism and advice related to that iron metabolism. So advice to potentially donate whole blood less often or to donate plasma. They generally perceived this to be acceptable because they felt as though this demonstrated concern for the health of the donor and would benefit the donor's health. Although people talked about this testing as being an acceptable because they thought it would improve the quality of donated blood, and they felt as though it would enable donors to donate for longer without being deferred, which they thought would have benefits for the sustainability of the blood supply. So generally speaking, they thought that there were a lot of benefits to this type of testing being conducted at Lifeblood and to this type of information being provided to donors. However, they did identify or start discussing boundaries to the kinds of testing that they thought would be acceptable for Lifeblood to conduct. So, for example, this participant quote is as long as the tests are limited to things that are protecting the safety of the donor and the recipient and the quality of the blood as well, and nothing else, then I would be happy with that. So that gives you an idea of how people started to think about where are the boundaries of the appropriateness of testing. And when we discussed whether they thought that they had consented to receive this information, participants were divided about this, whether they thought that existing donor consent would cover this type of testing or whether they would expect to provide additional consent. So some perceived that there was no need for additional consent because they thought the testing was for the benefit of the donor, while others thought that donors should be invited to opt in or out of this testing when they register to donate blood. So, you know, you would be given information about additional testing that you could opt in or out of. So with the third scenario, participants were quite divided about whether they thought it was acceptable for this type of testing to be undertaken at all by a blood collection agency. And so some people thought that it was appropriate because they thought this information was of benefit to the donor's health. And they saw this kind of information as part of a sort of continuum of information that a blood collection agency could obtain from blood. And they saw it as making good use of donor blood and of available technology and knowledge. However, they also noted that potentially if a blood collection agency did provide this information to donors, it may change the nature of the donor organization contract because as this participant sort of suggests in this second quote, it's no longer just altruistic, it's also care of me. So they sort of flagged, well, you know, if you're receiving health information as well as giving blood, does that alter the nature of the contract between blood donors and blood collection organizations? Other participants did not think that testing for disease markers was appropriate because it was not directly related to the core purpose of a blood collection agency. And they were concerned that while technology is making it possible to undertake this testing, donors would not know what to do with the information. They felt as though Lifeblood was did not have expertise in this type of testing. And they expressed concerns about the impact of receiving this information for them in terms of their health insurance and life insurance, and also the privacy and security of the information. So while some thought this testing shouldn't be undertaken at all by Lifeblood, other people thought that testing was acceptable if the donor had consented to it being conducted. And most of the concerns in relation to this scenario were in relation to people receiving test findings without knowing that this testing had been undertaken or that they could receive this kind of information from blood. So people felt as though if clear consent was provided and people were given the option to opt in or out of this type of testing, then it could be appropriate. And in discussions about scenarios 2 and 3, so the iron metabolism scenario and the genetic predisposition for bowel cancer scenario, participants identified quite a lot of benefits to them as donors from receiving additional information about their health through blood donation, because they saw it as providing them with information that they might not otherwise have received at this time, so that they wouldn't have undertaken this type of screening testing in another context. They wouldn't have gone to their doctors to be tested for this. So they thought that receiving this information through blood donation could complement other aspects of the healthcare system, such as visits to a GP. And they thought it was making good use of blood that had already been donated. And they actually thought that it demonstrated care for donors as well. But these discussions also raised a lot of questions about the implications of donors receiving this information through blood donation, such as potentially donors becoming ineligible to donate through receipt of this information. And they also talked about the idea that if Lifeblood undertook this testing, maybe it could benefit our healthcare system. Maybe it could take the load off GPs, maybe identifying disease predisposition early could reduce costs to the healthcare system associated with treating disease. So there were some other benefits that people identified. But they also, again, raised more concerns about who would have access to this information, how the information would be passed on to their doctors, and again, the implications for them in terms of insurances and privacy of the information. And another concern expressed by participants was that there may be confusion about what the role of Lifeblood is, and a lot of concerns about us having to clarify that we are not a healthcare provider and that information received from a blood collection agency should not replace the doctor-patient relationship. So a lot of their concerns related to they questioned whether Lifeblood had expertise in conducting genomic testing. They distinguished health information received through blood donation from information received from other health experts. And they thought that it was really important for Lifeblood to clearly explain the limits of any testing that was undertaken by them. That is, that it's not diagnostic and it's not the same as testing received through a GP. There were also sort of concerns expressed that people might come to donate blood to receive health results because it's free, and increasingly in Australia people are having to pay for GP visits. So overall, the sort of central concept identified through our analysis in this study was this idea that both donors and non-donors perceive there to be a core purpose of a blood collection agency. And we identified boundaries around which activities were considered to fall within this core purpose, which were recipient safety, donor health, making the best use of donated blood, better quality donations, and overall maintaining a sustainable blood supply. They were sort of the core activities that people associated with the blood donation agency. And some activities were considered to fall outside of that, including testing for disease predisposition. However, some of these boundaries were not always clear, with people identifying benefits of receiving additional information through blood donation as well as problems. So testing for disease predisposition was seen to be related to donor health and therefore potentially acceptable. It was seen to be related to making the best use of donated blood and therefore potentially to be acceptable. Preventative health was not seen to be part of the core remit of a blood collection agency. However, people were very enthusiastic about us potentially playing a role in preventative health. Again, there was a lot of discussion about us not being a healthcare provider and about us needing to be very clear about what our role is. Importantly, some people perceive benefits from receiving additional information about their health through blood donation, which suggests that blood collection agencies like Lifeblood could potentially expand their roles, but that donors would want to be clearly informed about the scope of testing and to consent to any additional testing. So overall, our participants viewed genomic testing of donor blood positively, but wanted transparency about current and future testing. And both donors and non-donors viewed testing of blood as appropriate when it assisted the core purpose of a blood collection agency, so managing, collecting and supplying blood. However, testing that doesn't directly optimize donor health or recipient safety was met with mixed feelings, including concerns surrounding privacy and data security. And, we found that consent in particular and clear communications were really important drivers to testing being accepted. So our recommendations from this research are that we educate donors about the testing that's already in place, like rare blood type testing, because donors just don't seem to know that we do that, and it's really risk-free. People regarded that testing as very, very positively, and it's a first step to introducing donors and non-donors to any genomic testing that may happen in the future. Secondly, with any new testing introduced, it's critical to sort of communicate with donors about how that's related to the core purpose of blood donation. So, you know, how does it benefit donors? How does it benefit recipients? Or how may it benefit sufficiency of the blood supply? So what's the link of that testing back to this sort of core purpose of what a blood collection agency does? Thirdly, donors and non-donors really care about consent, and gaining additional consent for any tests or uses of blood which may have implications for the donor's well-being is really critical. Fourthly, Lifeblood is not really viewed by our donors as having expertise in healthcare. We're viewed as having expertise in blood and analysis of blood, but not in healthcare. And obviously that's deliberate for us. We're not a healthcare provider. But if we do wish to provide donors with more health-related information, we need to establish this expertise or determine a clear workflow with health professionals to communicate health information to donors. And finally, this diagram sort of provides an idea of how our participants viewed the current core purpose of Lifeblood. So the leftmost circle, the innermost circle, is what Lifeblood currently does and what our consent currently covers. The second circle is what we could do, and consent may or may not cover this depending on the views of the individual. The third one is what we could be doing in the future. And it's definitely not thought to be covered by existing consent. So we would need to do a lot of work to move towards this testing with our donors. And so that's the end of my talk. And thank you so much for listening. And I'll stop sharing my screen and open up the floor for questions.
Excellent.